reversal of policies. And all of a sudden, zero COVID was effectively lifted. And since then, we've seen all kinds of social changes, political changes, economic reverberations. Of course, the health toll that it has taken in terms of the radical surge of COVID cases throughout December and into January, the number of people who were infected and many who died, and a lot of tragic stories that we've heard. And more recently, also, I think we've been seeing gleams of light with things starting to get back to normal for some pockets of society in China. And so it's really been a whirlwind, and so much has happened over the course of these last 3 months or so. We wanted to reconvene some members from our panel from last time and also welcome some new members to come together to collectively think about, reflect on what has happened. And it's, of course, very difficult to unpack that in 90 minutes. But what we've decided is to use a series of keywords and use these keywords to approach the changes that have happened in China over the last 3 months from a variety of different perspectives. And we have scholars on the panel also representing a variety of different disciplines. And so I'm going to introduce our panelists and then get out of the way and let them each share some reflections on their chosen keyword. And our first speaker will be Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom. He is Chancellor's Professor of History at the University of California, Irvine. He's the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of a dozen books, including Student Protests in 20th Century China, China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know, and Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink. Following Jeffrey, our second speaker will be Gina Tam, an associate professor of history and co-chair of women and gender studies at Trinity University in Texas. She is also a public intellectual fellow at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and book review editor for the Journal of Asian Studies. Her first book was entitled Dialect and Nationalism, which explores the relationship between language and national identity from the Qing all the way through the Mao period. And she is currently working on a new book about the relationship between gender and post-colonialism and the history of protests in post-war Hong Kong. Victor Shi is the Homyo Lam Chair in China and Pacific Relations at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. He is an expert on the politics of China's fiscal and financial policies, as well as elite politics in China. He is the author of 2 books entitled Factions and Finance in China and Coalitions of the Weak. He is also the editor of Economic Shocks and Authoritarian Stability. He is also an active member of the China Data Lab and is constructing a large database on biographical information on elites in China, as well as their activities. Nason Mahboubi, Mahboubi is a research scholar at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a lecturer in law at Penn Law School. He hosts the CSCC podcast and is one of the project leaders for the Penn Project on the future of U.S.-China relations. He also hosts Law and Governance series co-sponsored by the Penn Program on Regulation. His primary academic interests are in the areas of administrative law, comparative law, and Chinese law, and he is currently writing on the development of modern Chinese administrative law. Ting Guo is assistant professor of cultural and religious studies at Chinese University of Hong Kong, where she works on religion, politics, and gender in transnational Asia. She is writing a book entitled, she is writing her first book entitled Politics of Love, Religion, Secularism, and Love as a Political Discourse in Modern China. And her work has appeared or is forthcoming in a numerous array of journals, including the Journal of American Academy of Religion, Method and Theory in the Study of Religion, and Critical Research on Religion. She is also the co-host of a Mandarin language podcast entitled In Betweenness. And our final speaker will be Eileen Chao, who's an associate professor on the practice in Chinese and Japanese cultural studies at Duke University. She is a founding director of the Story Lab at Duke, and she is currently director of graduate studies for Duke's Asia Pacific Studies Institute East Asia Studies program. She is a founding core faculty member of the Duke Asian American and Diasporic Studies and director of the Cheng Shiwo Institute of Chinese Journalism at Shishin University in Taipei. She is the book series editor of Sinotheory at Duke University Press. I've had the pleasure of collaborating with her in that series, and I didn't anticipate our introductions to be quite this long, but now that that's out of the way, we can get to the good stuff. And I'm going to hand it over to Professor Wasserstrom to introduce our first keyword for the evening.
It's great to be here, to be joining this with all of you. And my keyword is globalization. And I think, of course, at one level, this kind of event is something that couldn't exist before a moment of globalization. But I think looking at the last couple of years related to China, it's been a reminder of just how complex and messy globalization is. And I think just how wrong two of the kind of enduring common ways of thinking about it, which are associated by books that I dislike intently, so I'm always glad when they're proved wrong, have been. So the two books I'm thinking of about this kind of era of globalization, one is The World is Flat, which has this idea that globalization kind of smooths things out, and the world, in some versions of it, becomes kind of Americanized, or at least everybody's on the same page. And the other book, which is also wrong in a different way, is The Clash of Civilizations, that says basically there's a globalizing world where we're all being knit together, but there are going to be these distinctive civilizations that stand apart from each other. And there'll be the West, there'll be China, there'll be the Middle East. And I think the two things I want people to remember about globalization is globalization has been going on for a long time. We've sort of been global for a long time, at least 150 years. A lot of things that we now associate with globalization, like messages rocketing around the world, news, information, rumors, that happened with the telegraph. Now it happens with the internet. So we've been global for a long time. But the other thing is we have never been global. And I think COVID really brought both these things home. COVID was clearly a product of kind of globalized flows. The speed with which it spread by airplane travel and things like that was all about movement, and the spread with which news went globally. But the never been global part of it is that different countries responded radically differently to COVID. And so it showed just how bumpy the world still is. And it was understood through different people thinking in different parts of the world, understanding it through metaphors and images and language that only made sense given quite particular histories. And there were every step of the way. The WHO was supposed to be this World Health Organization, but the flaws to that expectation for global flows of information were shown to be problematic from the beginning. And China played a big role in that problematic nature of it as well. But more than that, it was just that people responded very differently also within different parts of these kind of civilizational segments that Samuel Huntington talked about in The Clash of Civilization. So you just didn't have either the world becoming flat or becoming neatly divided in these different ways. That there were some people who tried to talk about a kind of East Asian response to COVID, but the response in Japan was very different than the response in China, and the response in Taiwan was different with some overlap, and so on and so forth. And I think as we move forward to this period now, whatever it is, still a pandemic era, but a partly post-pandemic era, the bumpiness is still there in how different places are coming out of it in different ways and defining normal in different ways. But I think we're also seeing in the geopolitical sphere how outdated and thoroughly ready for discarded the idea that any kind of clash of civilizations explains the breakdowns in the world, when we see alliances being formed that link, to some extent at least, China, Iran, and Russia, which clearly don't fall into any one civilizational strain there. We also see ways in which globalization is something that both keeps being different in how it affects Chinese politics and how Chinese politics handles it in, again, multiply complicated ways. A big part of Xi Jinping's early period was appearing at Davos and presenting himself as a globalizer. That isn't happening the same way anymore, and partly after COVID. But we also saw the protests with flows of information, slogans, and ideas inside and outside of China across borders showed that globalization is still knitting China to the world in all sorts of complicated ways. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. And we're going to move on to Professor Tam for our second speaker.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. So my keyword is gender, and I'd like to talk a little bit about how we ought to look at recent events through a gendered lens, specifically looking at the role of, or what happens when we look at the recent protests and recent history in China through the perspective of women. So in November, the white paper protests swept throughout China, and at the forefront of this movement were young women, frequently constituting a large portion of its participants and leadership. This is both notable but also unsurprising. Notable because in most social movements, we often pay attention to and give agency to male participants, often elevating outspoken men to the role of leader much more quickly than we do female participants who we often label as supporter. Yet at the same time, this is not surprising. If we think about a social movement as an attempt to grasp political power by people who are often disempowered by state institutions, women are uniquely situated to lead social movements because they are often uniquely disempowered. As we look back on this movement now to make sense of its significance, I think there are three reasons we ought to pay attention to gender dynamics. First, if we think about the A4 protests as widespread expression of dissatisfaction of the inequalities and injustices young people face today, these inequalities and injustices both created by and exacerbated by zero COVID policies, we should understand how they are gendered. Specifically in regards to zero COVID lockdowns, women who are much more likely to be caretakers and much more likely to be spending time at home were forced to deal with and use more of their labor to deal with the uncertainty and burdens of harsh and unpredictable policies. Moreover, the lockdowns made women much more susceptible to domestic violence, something that is not exclusively affects women, but overwhelmingly affects women, right? Leda Hong-Finchar in a recent op-ed noted this, and she quoted women's rights lawyer Li Ying, who reported a huge uptick in reports of domestic violence in the recent months. Beyond the specific effects of the lockdown, young people in China face a whole host of broader structural problems, which are often felt more acutely by women. Young people find a frustrated job market, which is both worse and more precarious for women. Young parents, often pressured to be young parents by family and society, find that having children these days is both expensive and burdensome. While this affects all young people, these burdens uniquely affect young women, who often bear the brunt of child-rearing responsibilities. So second, and relatedly, women in China also face unique oppression from the Chinese state, from the PRC state, making the stakes of protesting more acute. To return to the question of childbirth, women are often treated by the Chinese state as a source of reproductive labor. While Chinese women are generally able to access most forms of reproductive care, I come to you from Texas, so this is very, very vivid in my mind right now. Women in China also know that these don't amount to a right, so to speak, as the state has been all too willing in recent decades in modern history to use its power to dictate how, if, and when people with uteruses use their bodies for reproduction. Similarly, while China has laws protecting women from sexual and domestic violence, these laws rarely provide real or sustained legal protection. And let us be clear that for non-Han women, this oppression is even starker, as they are often burdened with the dual oppressions that stem from being both female and of a minoritized ethnicity. The final point I want to make here is perhaps slightly less depressing, in that the third reason we should look at these protests through a gendered lens is because it helps us understand how and why activism and social movements happen in China. This is certainly the first big protest to happen in China in a while. I know there's a lot of debate about how big and how do we measure these things. Either way, it's notable, its size, right? But feminist movements have been active in China for decades, and their work is critical for shaping how activism functions. First, they set a precedent for public protesting, having launched many small-scale protests or large-scale protests on domestic violence, sexual harassment, unequal infrastructures, both in person and online. But more importantly, and I want to give credit here to a Chinese feminist leader who I talked with recently, who asked me to keep her anonymous, but also said that I could quote her anonymously here. I wanted to give her credit, that these feminist movements create networks, and these networks allow young women to forge friendships, discuss problems, and work together towards solutions. The reason this matters is because the A4 protests didn't come out of nowhere. By looking at the precedents and, more importantly, at networks created by feminist groups, we have a fuller picture, not just why why, but how activism happens in China. So to sort of sum up, I know a lot of people here want to know what this means for the future of China. In particular, I'm interested in what this means for the future of activism in China. I'm a historian. I don't like predicting the future, so I don't really know what that future will look like. But I do think that if we want hints of what is to come, we should look at both how state and society treats women, as well as how women have responded, as that will be critical to understanding it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gina. I appreciate your contributions, and we're going to continue on with Professor Victor Xu from UC San Diego. Before Victor begins, I just want to remind our audience at any time during any of the talks, feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom to start listing your questions, and we look forward to engaging with all of you at the end. Professor Xu.
Hi, thank you, Michael and others, for inviting me. It's always great to get the group together. Hopefully, at some point, we'll do this in person. I feel like I need to chat with all of you, hopefully at the AAS or something like that. Anyway, so I just realized that I never emailed the group my keyword, but I think I'm going to pick something very esoteric so that I'm not going to grab anyone else's keyword. My keyword will be materialism in the Marxist sense. So I think China's policies to have zero COVID lockdown, as well as the rapid opening that we saw in December, were to some extent driven by the materialism that drives policymaking in China to a large extent. And by materialism, I mean that, like good Marxists, senior officials in the Chinese government, one of the things that they always keep in the back of their head is whether policies will expand the means of production, either by expanding labor and capital input, which then expand outputs, or that through technological innovation, these technologies will help China expand production in some sense. So, of course, we saw that the lockdown policy was very successful in 2020 and 2021. And by the metric that the policymakers in China care about, which is that industrial production recovered very, very rapidly, export recovered very, very rapidly. China ran these humongous trade surplus, especially vis-a-vis the United States, actually, despite the tariffs, despite the sanctions and all that kind of stuff. Industrial production scaled back to some extent in the US because of COVID, because we're dealing with COVID. Meanwhile, in China, because of zero COVID, COVID for a while did not spread so much in China. Factories were able to resume production very rapidly. The state council and the party also made it a very high priority to resume production, industrial production, in the various provinces. That policy was very successful. It ran into trouble going into 2022, as we know, right? So first in Shanghai, later on in northern China, despite zero COVID, COVID still spread. Even major facilities like Foxconn plant in Henan, for example, COVID was spreading rampantly. No measures that the factory itself tried to institute worked. Workers began to abandon their posts, left, and even engage in protests and riots, etc. So then going into late 2022, China's economy was kind of in free fall. It wasn't just because of the spread of COVID, which of course, when you have lockdown in multiple cities, there will not be any economic activities, and by definition, GDP is going to fall. The deleveraging policy, which also was rolled out in 2020, also did not help, because one major leg of China's economy always is real estate sales. Real estate sales collapsed, land sales collapsed, local revenue collapsed, and so that also created a big problem for the Chinese government. Nonetheless, I think this economic slowdown was a good argument that technocrats, and it's unclear to me which technocrat, brought to Xi Jinping, because the decision to open certainly was approved by Xi Jinping. There's just no other way. He heads all the leading groups. He's the most powerful politician China has seen since Chairman Mao. So he would have needed to approve it. But of course, he supported zero COVID for 3 years, almost 3 years. And so it must have been some kind of process to persuade him to abandon zero COVID. And I think, most likely the argument was consistent with his very materialist worldview. Again, so all top Chinese policymakers had this worldview of materialism. Someone must have brought the evidence of collapsing economic growth, collapsing revenue intake, to persuade him to abandon policy. Of course, he then abandoned it very rapidly, with hardly any kind of what public health experts would say would be necessary preparation for opening, massively procure Paxlovid, have a mass vaccination campaign, etc. None of that was done, or hardly any of it was done. And as a result, there's a very tremendous human toll, the exact extent of which we're still trying to find out. I think this will go down a little bit like the Great Leap Forward, where generations of scholars will just have to do a lot of painstaking research to reconstruct the extent of the human toll. Add that to the social toll of both the lockdown policy that Gina, very accurately described, and also the social toll of rapid reopening. So I think the materialist driver of China's policy making works to some extent, because when the only thing you care about is the economy, in the short term at least, it will help drive economic growth, and China's policy is fairly successful on that front. But the materialism also causes policymakers to neglect all the heavy social costs of the policy. Sometimes there's very little social costs. Of course, we know, for example, abandoning collectives and going for household responsibility, that was a great policy that made farmers a lot wealthier, and so on and so forth. But sometimes this materialist focus of policymaking can have heavy social costs, and these costs are building up, as Gina has pointed out, and it's that is also going to shape the future of China, not just economic growth. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. And we're going to turn to Nason. And apologies, Nason, when I stumbled on your name during the introductions, but now the floor is yours.
No problem. I'm delighted to be here and to join this group in this second conversation. I thought my keyword was balloon, but I've been informed that the keyword is law. So I will focus on law. I want to take as a starting point, draw a connection to a very good point that my dear colleague, Victor Shi, just made, analogizing the zero COVID policy and the last 3 years of experience with that to something like an event like the Great Leap Forward. I would add perhaps the Cultural Revolution. And in drawing that analogy, I don't think the point is that the level of suffering was even remotely analogous, but as far as it being a mass mobilization that affects everything in the country, everyone in the country in a very particular way, I do think that analogy is quite good. And if that's right, if we can think of it that way, I think all of us now as scholars, now that we're on the other side of this, not obviously the pandemic generally, but at least on the other side of China's very particular zero COVID approach to it, this is the time where we really start to reflect on what it all meant for each of the different areas that each of us individually studies. For me, looking at law, the broader story here, irrespective of the pandemic and of the zero COVID policy, has been the way in which the Xi Jinping administration has appropriated a lot of the language of legal reform that predated the Xi Jinping administration and kind of moved the legal system in ways that further centralize authority with Xi Jinping, of course, at the top of the pyramid. And so if you're interested in the story of legal development under Xi Jinping, you'll be very interested, I think, in what exactly the significance of the last 3 years has been. For those of us who do think about legal development in China, including legal development under Xi Jinping, I think a broad framework which is helpful to keep in mind is that, of course, there's a very strong top-down dimension, and a top-down dimension that has become even more robust under Xi Jinping, as I just suggested. But there's also a bottom-up dimension, or at least a quasi-bottom-up dimension. And as a legal scholar, what has particularly interested me in the last few years have been the various, perhaps slight, perhaps more robust, we can debate that, ways in which that bottom-up or quasi-bottom-up dimension of the development of Chinese law has reflected itself. And so let me give a few very particular examples of what I have in mind. First, during the early days of the pandemic, when the failings of Wuhan's regulatory response in the immediate first days of the pandemic was clear, not only to foreign observers, but also to many Chinese domestic observers, there were a number of Chinese legal commentators who criticized and publicly criticized the regulatory response in Wuhan, framing their criticism in terms of existing legal requirements that were not followed by the Wuhan authorities. That is a very particular kind of argumentation that is not necessarily calling into question the legitimacy of the regime or even pointing particular blame at central authorities, but using existing Chinese law and regulation to point out the failings of lower level officials, in this case, Wuhan and perhaps provincial as well. There was a similar type of argumentation from legal scholars around the time of the Shanghai lockdown back in April of last year, including famously Tong Zhiwei, a professor from East China University of Politics and Law, wrote a couple of open letters showing all the different ways in which the very aggressive lockdown in Shanghai at that time contravened different kinds of Chinese laws and regulations. And again, this is not a systemic challenge, but rather simply pointing out how some of the particular local officials' government actions were not in line with existing legal requirements. That moment was a little bit more sensitive than the moment immediately following the early days of the pandemic. A number of different scholars, not just Tong Zhiwei, put commentary up online around that time, also pointing out deficiencies with other aspects of the zero COVID policy, including nucleic acid testing, including types of things like taking keys from people's houses, moving people into other areas. And a lot of those commentaries were, as we like to say, harmonized. They were removed from the web, but I thought it was important at the time that they were at least initially articulated, and even after they were harmonized, were still passed around, and to me, demonstrated that there was still some room for the kind of bottom-up, or let's say, because these were legal scholars within the official apparatus, quasi-bottom-up discussion of Chinese law. Then the last thing I want to say briefly in this sort of initial portion of my remarks is to say that in the aftermath of the 20 measures that were articulated by the central government in early November of last year, as the central government was beginning to indicate that there might be some loosening of the zero COVID policy, and local governments were not entirely, I think, sure that that was really something they were authorized to do. And so local governments were still acting in ways that now contravened these new 20 measures. When those protests broke out, and the protests, of course, we talked about in the earlier panel discussion in this series, many of the protesters used the language of the 20 measures in a legalistic way as a kind of policy-based resistance. I think everyone, both on this stage and in terms of the audience, will be well familiar with Kevin O'Brien and Li Lianzhang's work on rightful resistance, when protesters use the language of authority to push back on particular types of impositions that seem to violate that. And there's a whole discussion that many people here will have lots of different views about as to whether that's really rightful resistance or rules-based resistance. But I think for purposes of now, I just want to underscore that the language of the central authorities about sort of legal norms did end up being articulated in what I think was a truly bottom-up way, not a quasi-bottom-up way, but a bottom-up way. And now that we're past zero COVID and we're reflecting now on those 3 years and these various moments of pushback by different kinds of actors and what we see going forward, at least I think those are important and interesting moments, that the combination of the pushback from legal scholars and from protesters that was voiced in terms of the language of authority, of law and regulation, even under this regime that has tried to appropriate that for the top-down dimensions only. I think that's important. And as we go forward, I will be reflecting on whether that means something important about what the nature of Chinese legal development is going to be going forward, that perhaps it is not simply Xi Jinping all the way down, but that there are still some real ways in which bottom-up and quasi-bottom-up discourse about law will have some significance in Chinese development.
Thank you, Nathan, for your thoughtful comments. Our next speaker is Ting Guo from Chinese University of Hong Kong.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for having me. It's a really honor and pleasure to be here. My keyword would be border. And it's interesting to talk about, discuss this notion as my parents just recently crossed the border, the Hong Kong mainland China border to Hong Kong to visit me. And there's a lot for us to catch up. And literally, we do feel how the border has created parallel universes. In particular, in difficult times, such as the COVID. And I also remember when COVID first broke out, when I was in Hong Kong and they were not that far away across the border in mainland China, but I wasn't able to help at all. I wasn't able to send any support. So I'm going to talk about how borders are created, but at the same time, how borders are always challenged and how borders are always challenged with very real, concrete, embodied border crosses. I think since I'm in Hong Kong and I was in Hong Kong throughout the pandemic, so I'm going to focus on the border, the notion of the border in Hong Kong in relation to mainland China. I think the border between Hong Kong and mainland China was created rather late, in the very late stage of the colonial era. Some of the new territory borders were created even and not created until 1899, so that was very, very late. And before and after the creation of such borders, most people in Hong Kong were not aware of the existence of border. That border, the notion of border didn't exist. They were traveling back and forth between Hong Kong and mainland China, what becomes Hong Kong and mainland China at the time, without having the idea of there such border existed. And Hong Kong was described by many historians, including Elizabeth Sin, as a space of flows to exactly describe that kind of no border space, or a space of transience. But at the same time, borders are very real, as we have seen from the pandemic, and also in Hong Kong's during the colonial days and also during the Cold War, borders were created for ideological reasons and political reasons. During the Cold War, the colonial government and the church created this ideological border to reinforce the social power of social operation of Christianity in order to resist the fervor for communism in mainland China, to resist the ideological influence from mainland China. So that's one way to see how borders are created, and for ideological and political reasons. And also in Hong Kong, in the early 2000s, there were a much controversy regarding anchor babies, also that refers to children born in Hong Kong by mainland parents, or so-called tourism, birth tourism. So that made things very difficult for both parts. For Hong Kongers, that was seen as a kind of burden on the already very difficult healthcare system. But for the mainlanders who chose to do that, to cross the border for that particular reason, that was also because of the resources that they sought. that they considered insufficient in mainland China. And also when the pandemic first started, there was a large strike led by Hong Kong's medical workers asking to close down the border. But what's interesting is that over 85% of the people who were crossing the border from China to Hong Kong at the time, most of them were actually Hong Kong residents, Hong Kongers who were living in mainland China because they couldn't afford living in Hong Kong. And also because of the anchor babies emerging in the early 2000s, we also have cross-border students, young students, children even, who were crossing the border. There were, I think in the last year, over almost 30,000 young students crossing the border every day, even during the pandemic. That's just even the borders were physically made, ideologically created, politically created, but at the same time, there were all these people who are crossing the borders, sometimes voluntarily, but sometimes involuntarily for various reasons. But there's another way of kind of understanding embodied, very concrete, real border crosses, but in a more active way as to how we understand that from the perspective of activism. I think Gina mentioned the 8-4 revolution, a white paper movement in China. What is interesting is that the white paper revolution or the movement was very much influenced by the protests in Hong Kong in the past few years, as real as kind of detailed as the slogans even, and also the 4 demands, and later that became 5 demands. And that, of course, is also something that they learned from the Hong Kong movement as well. And more recently, Hong Kong director Johnny To made a kind of very courageous speech, much praised at a Berlin Film Festival. And that speech was very quickly kind of reposted, reshared on mainland social media, despite how sensitive that might be. So there's always kind of those actions to cross the border against those ideologies and politics exactly created the border for these reasons. And also the feminist movements, also Gina mentioned earlier as well. And so the globalization Jeff mentioned, that's also interesting. Almost all the social movements, social activism in China and in Hong Kong, they have all been transnational. Either they have been influenced or they have been part of the larger movements in Southeast Asia, the Milk Tea Alliance, or the larger global Me Too movement as well. But what does border mean for us now? How do we move forward, think forward? I think for many of the active border crossers, there's been a sense that they know more about the world than the world knows about them. I think that's even clearer during the pandemic when all the Asian hate happened. That just shows how the world actually knows very little about what's behind those borders and those very embodied real human beings who cross the borders and have been translating against the borders, across the borders for the world. So I think all of us here, the speakers here, you have all been translators of different worlds, different ideologies, and different borders. I think in the future, there will be more demand for such translators, for such border crossers. And I think I'm hopeful that there will be more, but I'm also thinking it is important that we remain cautious about how the borders will always bounce back to challenge us, but how we should actually, perhaps we have already been doing so much. The panel, for instance, is one example, but there will always be more demand for us to cross the border. Thank you.
Thank you, Ting. And as we move to our final speaker, I just want to send out another reminder to our audience to please post your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll be coming to our Q&A section soon. But without further ado, I want to turn it over to Professor Eileen Chao from Duke University.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me? So I asked Michael if we could, thank you for including me in this panel as the round two. And also that I asked Michael if we could go reverse alphabetical precisely because my keyword today is diaspora, or actually more accurately distance and dispersal. So going back to a kind of etymological root of diaspora, which is the spreading of seeds, which is of course an organic metaphor, which is also related to a very organic understanding of the Chinese diaspora, whether it be Luoye Guigen or, this idea of the tree and the spreading of seeds of the Sinophone. But one thing that I do feel like that I've observed in this period of time, and I would loathe to call it post-COVID, as we are still very much in the era, and as Victor said, this is going to be, I think, decades of understanding, right? That we are really going to look back at this period, and whether it be analogous to the Great Leap Forward or other eras, but that we truly do not have a holistic picture at this point in time. But while we are, situated within this moment, the keyword that struck me was really the long tail of COVID, even starting in 2020, and the completely asynchronous experience of COVID around the world, certainly. I was in Shanghai in January 2020 and then returned to the US. And so I was filled with keen anxiety, but of course everyone in the US was not. And so there was already this, that sense of asynchronicity or syncopation was so powerful at that moment already. And this is something that a lot of us have discussed, but I think also within the so-called Chinese diaspora, that people were experiencing it in very, very different ways. And that's why my keyword is dispersal and distance, I guess, distance. To think about if a larger project of the Chinese state from the Republican era on has been to really use that organic metaphor to unify, or at least to reach out to, or to create a network within the diaspora of people who don't necessarily identify as being part of that diaspora, but whether through consent or dissent, D-E-S-C-N-T, or dissent, D-I-S-S-E-N-T, this was thought of as this kind of dispersed network that could then have a meaningful relationship with the central state. And but I think that one of the things that COVID has done has really made, Jeff was mentioning the bumpiness of globalization that has really surfaced. I think the kind of distance and disperse and asynchronous understanding of what it means to be Chinese or Chinese affiliated has completely become moved into the foreground in these past years. And also the questioning of that organic metaphor, even to the extent that the way that we understand disease and how it spreads. I think all the things that people have mentioned in terms of the language of authority and how it could be used in one way or another, but also the kind of positive, you could say, language of gender movements and language of, the disempowered as a kind of seed for protests and alliances, borders as both patrolling but embodying, as Ting has mentioned, were all ways that you could say that kept on expanding and contracting throughout this period. But I just want to quickly go back to a much earlier moment, actually 217 AD, when Cao Zhi was talking about a particular moment of pestilence in his famous essay called Shuo Yi Qi on pestilence. And he says in 2017, pestilential qi circulated. Every household suffered death. In every house, people wailed and wept in grief. But by the end of the essay, which is not that long an essay, it's a very compact, essay written in classical Chinese, of course, by the middle of the essay, he's already saying those who suffered from it were children of the destitute. Those families who lived in palatial houses rarely suffer so terribly. And by the end of the essay, he's already saying ignorant people hung up talismans to expel the pestilential qi. That is laughable. So within even the discourse of this short essay on pestilence, he goes from saying every household suffered death and everybody experienced grief to immediately recognizing material reality, the difference in experience based on people's material circumstances within a society. And by the and also questioning people's medical knowledge and understanding of science. And I think that's exactly my biggest takeaway for what has happened in this Greater China region, that the asynchronicity of experiencing COVID, the reaction, various national policies of, and the unexpected and expected successes. So maybe the TPP in early 2020 in closing Taiwan's borders did not necessarily think this was going to be the most brilliant move ever, but it was the most brilliant move ever, both politically for the DPP, but also, of course, from a public health standpoint, because China, Taiwan, like New Zealand and other places, in their full shutdown, actually, and especially shutdown from Hong Kong and China visitors, allowed for Taiwan to basically not have a breakout till May 2021, right? So in a sense, the zero lockdown policy was most successfully enacted in Taiwan, in a totally different political circumstance, and it was actually primarily against China. So it's really easy. So it's really interesting for me when I see China zero COVID, because I think of Taiwan zero COVID as an earlier moment, and frankly, a successful moment in public health policy. But it was driven precisely by the sense of dispersal and distance from China, that it was driven by the idea that we will not be with China. And so that is one example that I think dispersal distance has played out in the last couple of years. And as in 217 AD, whatever earlier moment of solidarity, globally, in terms of like banging pots and pans and singing opera out of your windows, that early, moment of that seems almost, pre-halcyon days of early COVID, quickly dispersed. People immediately recognize the social unevenness of COVID in not only in countries but neighborhoods, the dispersal of medical knowledge and medical availability in terms of vaccines, the choices, the legitimacy of rule in various places as tested by the differential reactions to disease, the framework of values that were revealed, how fear amplified and clarified and showed primarily people with deep and intimate, you could say, because of diaspora ties to the PRC, suddenly recognizing its complete distance and alienation from Chinese policy, right? That this, whether it be the language of authority or the language of reform, so many people within the diaspora suddenly saw itself as completely dispersed and different from what they perceived in China. And framework of values were also clarified. And the social consequence of disease, the moral accounting of disease, as in Cao Zhi, as in Xi Jinping, right? I mean, these moments of time in which, certain kinds of policies and structures were tested. I think finally, I just wanted to say that, I think one of the things that a lot of people have talked about during this period, of course, is Georg Semmel's, return to his sociological structure of thinking about strangers who are physically close but socially distant, like all of us, but a kind of co-presence, that might be shared through social status or similar types of labor or economic circumstance. But yet, at the same time, people who might be very physically intimate with us, our DoorDash delivery, our migrant labor working next door, was being in common, but at an immense social distance. And I think so physical distance, affective distance, and social distance all became huge talking points and made people that were incredibly clarified during this period. But also maybe in a more positive valence, and I really appreciate Gina's comments about gender and activism, that, in some ways activated networks, that, that long time, activism done by women and other disempowered groups were certainly were able to surface because that structure was already there. Young women stood up, not because they were the most brave, in many ways they were, but also because they were ready. They had done this and they were ready to go. Right. And as Ting mentioned, it was also because a lot of disempowered groups paid attention to transnational solidarities. So they saw how activism was happening elsewhere. And so they could also respond quickly and with very powerful symbols like A4. And those ties of solidarity, the networks, activism, mutual aid groups also thickened. And I should say that one irony, and I know Ting knows this so well because she was such a strong activist in helping people get food during the Shanghai lockdown, is that one of the ways that the fall protests happened so quickly was people were systemically tied to their neighbors in a way that probably neighborhoods in China had not been for quite a while, right? So, but they were, because of both zero COVID policy, that meant that you had your neighborhood busybody who was assigned to test you and inspect you and make sure you didn't have strangers in your house and all these things. But it also meant that immensely thick ties of WeChat circles and neighborhood groups had been created from zero COVID that quickly could transform into protest networks and solidarity networks. And the final thing I was going to say was language. Of course, I am, feeling like the literature person on the panel besides Michael, but, is the language, I love Nathan's point about, the language of authority and the language of reform were actually kind of in dialogical, right, in this moment, and people singing the Internationale at protests, etc., as a kind of jiu-jitsu move or a tuisho move, a pushing hands move to turn language against itself, right? But also one of the things that really touched me, so we had in November a gathering on Duke campus that they expected to have 24 people show up, more than 600 people showed up. But one of the things about the event, and this happened in many places, was that the converse, as people spoke out in turn, people learned new norms of language. One of them was actually shushing men who went on too long. That a lot of women says, stop letting the men dominate and let the women speak. And this was something that for a lot of the young men I talked to afterwards, they learned. They had not experienced this, especially being, I think, elite men, Han men. But the other was language of transnational solidarities. It was the first time I heard PRC students say, I'm sorry to Hong Kong protesters, to Hong Kong students, to Xinjiang students, but it was a kind of certain language. And then finally, the thing I was going to mention was a young woman who is an activist spoke in English first. And she said, because I grew up in China and I have no language of protest. I don't know how to say these words in Chinese, so I'm going to say these words in English. But by the latter half of the protest, she said, can I speak again? Because I think I have found my language in Chinese. I now know how to say the words I want to say in Chinese. I think in that sense, all the physical distance, affective distance, and social distance that COVID has created in the Sinosphere has also created and forged new moments of intimacy and solidarity. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Eileen, and thanks to all of our panelists. We here are presented with this list: globalization, gender, materialism, law, border, and diaspora. 6 very rich terms, and we had 6 wonderful presentations to kind of unpack them. At the same time, I feel like we're only just, it's the tip of the iceberg, because there is so much to discuss. And again, to our audience, think of your questions, put them in the Q&A box, but in order to get the discussion going, maybe I'll open with a question. And I thought maybe I would frame it through my own keyword. And just as I was listening to you speak, I thought about what would be my keyword if I was among you as a speaker and a panelist. And I think it might be seesaw. And that is the radical back and forth. I mean, just think of from zero COVID to ubiquitous COVID after the opening up in December and January, where some estimates were as much as perhaps 80% or higher of the population had tested positive for COVID-19. But I think it's a bigger keyword than that, because we go back to 2020 and we think about the way in which there were certainly a lot of terrible missteps during the early handling of the lockdown in Wuhan. But very quickly, you had this very effective lockdown, you had effective government response, and especially in the light of the failure of taking federal response in, say, the United States and Europe, and the massive number of deaths that we saw, especially here in the United States, the COVID response became almost an unofficial political referendum in terms of which form of government is better. And for a lot of young Chinese people during that period in 2020, a lot of them felt the CCP is taking care of me. They are a much more effective government for us than, because look at what's happening in the West. Of course, fast forward another year and we have the Shanghai lockdowns, the Xi'an lockdowns, and you start getting this radical sense of disillusionment on the part of a lot of especially younger people. And so this shift was, I think, this kind of seesaw back and forth is leading into the question that I want to pose to you, which is, after all of these back and forths, where do we stand now in terms of public morale, especially for younger generations who spent their formative years growing up amid this back and forth, this seesaw of lockdowns, and seeing the dabai, the hazmat suit healthcare workers, go from public heroes to kind of villains in terms of public discourse and how they were situated. And I would love to hear from a few of our presenters from a variety of responses of what are you hearing from your students, from those of you who have recently been to Hong Kong. Where are younger people standing in terms of their perspective on these radical changes and the kind of seesaw that they've been living through for the past 3 years?
Well, I guess I can try to answer this very quickly. So I think it really depends on people's lived experience in this very tumultuous period. So the opening certainly benefited, some people who, like if you're a restaurant owner or something like that, COVID lockdown was very painful. And so reopening, business comes back. Some young people, maybe it became easier for them to find jobs. But if you're a young person and your grandmother passes away because of COVID, you're probably not going to be very happy. This reminds me of this article I just reviewed recently, which I like a lot. It actually uses new methodology, whatever. And basically it tries to assess the level of support that people in China have for the Chinese government. And one of the very striking findings is that, well, if you're a male Han college educated, then you support the government more. And then, of course, the author goes on to, with this all kinds of explanation. But to me, it's like, well, that's very simple. It's like, yeah, that category of people are the winners in Chinese society. Like if you're a woman, if you don't have college education, which often means that you're a migrant worker, Chinese government policies are not especially favorable to you. So there's indeed, in the survey results, you do see lower level of support for the government among people who are neglected by Chinese government policies. So I think it really depends on people's lived experience.
If I could add on to that, I want to start with an anecdote from one of my students in Texas to sort of think how I'm thinking about this. And this was I believe a year and a half ago. It was the first semester we were back we were in person. And I asked my students a few weeks into class, I'm like, how are we doing? And one of them said, well, I don't really know what the world is going to look like in 10 years or if we're even going to be here because of climate change. But, I'm happy to be here and making friends. And I think about that a lot because I think that there's a level of precarity that young people feel, and I think all of us feel, but young people in particular feel both, I think everywhere, right? Is that there's just no sense of how or when or if things are going to change. And the bottom sort of fell out for all of us in the things that we could sort of take for granted and presume were stable. Like I think about borders a lot and how so many people had sort of created futures for themselves on the presumption that border crossings and like a certain level of openness of borders would remain stable. And of course, that is a system of privilege, of course, because there are some people who have always felt that precarity. But I think now all of us feel that kind of precarity. Another thing, I just having gotten back from Hong Kong, and this is by no means a scientific survey here, but my general experience was that a lot of people my age or younger have suddenly rethought, do I want to get married? Do I want to have a family? Do I want to bring children into this world? Because I have no idea what's going to change. I have no idea what the world is going to look like. I have no idea what Hong Kong is going to look like. And I think that I don't know what that means for the future, but my general sense everywhere is that there's a new level of living with precarity that has really changed, I think, everybody's way of looking, like, and thinking of seesawing, of how that has affected the world.
Could I add a brief word here? Michael, the question you posed eventually made its way to young people, but in its initial formulation, I think was a little bit broader. And I just wanted to say two quick things about this. One, that I feel personally very much the fact that I haven't been able to go to China in 3 years. For a long time, I thought one of my strengths as a scholar of China was that I spent a lot of time on the ground in China and traveling throughout China. And so I felt I had a real sense of the pulse of things. And I don't feel, I mean, I've done my best, as I'm sure all of us have, to maintain contacts with my friends and colleagues through various channels, but I don't think I have that same sort of finger on the pulse that I used to. And so I'm very eager to now go back, that at least the possibility seems to be imminent if the prices come down. And so I want to know the answer to your question, but I feel like I don't know yet, and I would like to learn that pretty soon. The second thing I just want to say is that because I don't know the answer to the first part, but I'm curious about, is whether the seesaw that you were describing earlier, and especially the sense that I think could have percolated in this most immediate period, that China's zero COVID policy went on too long, and that what had at one time been viewed as a comparative strength when you looked at other nations' responses ended up becoming more of a weakness. I just wonder if that could be the same kind, not exactly the same, but a kind of impetus for legal reform, in the same way that, obviously in a much more dramatic way, the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution was a major impetus for legal reform. And again, I don't want to draw these analogies too easily, but it seems at least plausible to me that if a large portion of the population feels like the government ultimately may not have made all the right calls in its very aggressive approach over the last couple of years, it could be some kind of a source of momentum for a new round of bottom-up or quasi-bottom-up legal reform.
Thank you. I think Ting and then Jeff.
Yeah, I was gonna kind of share another anecdote for Gina's example. In my new batch of graduate students this year at CUHK, one student, when he first appeared, he had complete blonde hair. I thought that might be kind of a fashionable choice, but it turns out it wasn't because of fashion. It was because of zero COVID policy, or the abolishment of zero COVID policy. So the student was living in Lhasa in Tibet, and the day the announcement appeared that there will not be zero COVID policy, that he was able to go out for the first time in 3 years, that he went crazy. He had no idea what to do. He decided to just almost literally run naked around in the city and then dye his hair. And so that sense of uncertainty and that fear of not knowing what was happening or what is happening, I think that's very strong among the young people in particular. And also until December 2022, I was still teaching at U of T, and many of our students overseas Chinese students, and many of them were absent throughout the whole year because of zero COVID policy. And I think the reopening of the borders made them question many of the choices, whether they still want to go out or what were the 2 years almost wasted time of not being able to take part in many of the things despite the high tuition fees. How would they make sense of that? And but the reopening of borders, the end of the zero COVID policy, also allowed many families to reunite. I'm just thinking about diasporas, not just diasporas, mainland Chinese diasporas in Hong Kong, but also Chinese diasporas around the world today in North America. Many of them, they were able to reunite with the families. But then many of them would be rethinking of their choices of immigration or migration. But these are the ones who are able to make a choice, able to have a choice. And many of those who experience zero COVID lockdowns and zero COVID policy, who there's a new word on the Chinese internet, run in Mandarin. So, people want, because of zero COVID, just wanted to kind of immigrate. But that's not the answer to everything, right? You have to have the means to be able to run. You have to have the means to be able to make the change happen. And many of those who experienced lockdown, who are still living with that uncertainty and living with, I think just what my student experience, living with that just fuzziness of not knowing anything at all. I think that's, in particular for the young people, that's very real. Yeah, I think, and for many other who almost rejoice in the reopening of the borders, but there's also the call for not forgetting about the zero COVID lockdowns and zero COVID policy, in particular because of many of the young people are arrested at the moment or detained because of the involvement in the white people movement. So there's also a very conscious, active cause for not forgetting zero COVID policy, not forgetting what has happened in order to move forward, in order to move on. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff.
So I just had a couple of thoughts. One was being out of touch with what's going on in China. I was very struck by a couple of things. Alec Ash, who's been living in China through this period, wrote and then said he's working on a book about living in Yunnan. And the first thing he wrote was about how he finally took his first COVID test and how it just turned upside down the image of China being a place where everybody was more controlled and the state was more invasive. The state didn't reach certain places, just really out of the way. And the people, he's writing partly about a kind of dropout culture. And I know there's a question about the lying flat trend. So that's there. And then he also said, though, in an interview after he left, that when he got to Beijing and then he came back to the UK for the first time in a long time, that when he was in Beijing, he had never heard people as thoroughly pissed off and fed up with the government as he ever had before. And so sort of balancing these contradictions. And since youth has been brought up, I think it's important to note that the most recent protest this year was older people concerned about a different kind of precarity. But I would also add to, these were such wonderful presentations. And the first one after me, Gina's, was great to say there was no surprise that it was women playing the roles. It was also no surprise it was young people playing the roles in the white paper revolution. And this kind of sense of precarity that is particularly felt by the young. It's partly about climate change. It's partly about people in Hong Kong. The young are the people who are going to live with the results of the current system longer. And I think this is something that we've been very slow on the uptake, even though there's been a sense of how important generation is. But it is one of the things about this period of globalization. You have people feeling a sense of connection across all kinds of borders, as Ting was talking about, based on a kind of youth. And I think actually with what you were saying, Eileen, about the students, mainland students apologizing to the Hong Kong students, there are many ways to think about it. But one is thinking about their generation and their age becoming a kind of commonality that they hadn't thought about before. The Milk Tea Alliance is largely young people across East and Southeast Asia. It was no accident that Joshua Wong and Greta Thunberg were sharing social media solidarity to each other, which was the solidarity wasn't about materialism or class. It was about, we're both struggling with a situation where the adults have really screwed it up. and they've screwed it up for us for longer than it's going to be screwed up for them. So anyway, those are just the kind of random thoughts I had.
Thank you. Eileen, did you want to respond to this?
I feel like so many wonderful points already have made. So if you want to move on, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, well, feel free to jump in if you want to add anything
Yeah.
at any time. I wanted to circle back to Nathan real quickly because you originally teased us with balloon as your keyword. And of course, that enticed me a little bit because they're both airborne, they're both spherical, they're both not supposed to be seen, although we saw the spy balloon, and they both inspired this incredible xenophobic, this paranoia vis-a-vis China. But I would love to give you a moment to maybe unpack a little bit about what you wanted to say about balloons as a
Also,
possible-
before Nathan responds, I want to say that I was also very excited when you said balloons, because actually I've been teaching the film Arrival, and Ted Chiang's story of your life, and the film Arrival. And of course, the first scene of Arrival is that the aliens that the balloons simultaneously appear in different places, and one of them, the first place, is Montana. And so I was like, great, we're shooting aliens now. But so I was excited to hear about balloons.
So the only thing I'm going to say about the balloon, which I have to say I still find absolutely delightful as a topic, is I genuinely felt maybe what the balloon was sighted maybe like early February, right? The meeting, the Secretary Blinken's trip to China was, I think, in the first few days of February, and it was right before he went. But right before the sighting of the balloon, I felt that there was some reason to think that the US-China relationship had maybe begun to stabilize, and that both sides were trying to play nice a bit. And there was this possibility of Americans starting to go to China again after 3 years, and significant for all the reasons we've talked about so far. And I'm still kind of amazed at how much the balloon seems to have knocked us off that trajectory, which already was I think, contingent trajectory, which had lots of pitfalls ahead of it. But it seems like we're very far today from that moment that we were at the very end of January. And so I think that's my main point here. And it relates to our discussion about the zero COVID policy, because it felt like after China being closed off for 3 years, something that I think all of us here have felt very deeply, it really did feel like we were about to be able to go back to China and kind of go back to the kinds of exchanges that have been missing for the last 3 years. And maybe we still can, but it has felt like the last few weeks has been a step back. And how far of a step back, I don't quite know, but I feel a little less, I think, optimistic about the return to the pre-COVID world than I did in late January, and all because of the balloon.
So I thought you were going to be all upbeat on the balloon, and I was going to have to be downbeat, but you went so downbeat that, if you believe that the biggest political trial in the history of Hong Kong has been going on the last couple of weeks, the amount of oxygen to cover that is gone, because there's basically one China story at a time, please. And so, there were reports of this trial, but I think this is getting back to something about the seesaw and the speed of reversals. It's really, as somebody who's been more obsessing really on Hong Kong than on some of these other things this whole time, I'm struck by the disconnect between the incredible patience and skill of slowly ratcheting up, strangling civil society in Hong Kong that was done. People talk about it feeling like it happened so fast that Hong Kong's liberties are gone. It's been so slow. It was a full 2 years or something before the statues disappeared from the campuses. It was a year before the last independent major newspaper shutdown. It was right after the national security law. People said, oh, everybody you know must be in jail. And I said, well, no, But then over time, a lot of them are either the activists that I was interested in are either in jail or silenced or are in exile. But it was slow and gradual. It was patient, and it was very effective through that. And that happening at the same time that on some other policy fronts, it's this speedy reverse. I think that's one of the things that's so disorienting.
Thank you. You know, what I'd like to do is move to some of our audience questions, and we don't have a lot of time left, so maybe we can try to get through as many as we can with fairly succinct answers, if that's okay, with our panel. But I'm going to start with this question from JW. How do we make sense of the role played by rumors, conspiracies, and tropes in the perceptions and constellations of zero COVID? I also wonder about how folks in the PRC and maybe Hong Kong challenge the legitimacy of that political paradigm by imagining and appealing to rather rosy visions of the West and liberal and democratic ideals. Zero COVID gave people the opportunity to get a taste of what life can be without the state and maybe even without allegiance to a nation. So what do you think about the potential for egalitarian visions of society flourishing in the PRC that replicate neither the West holographies or itself, nor PRC's narrative of a non-exploitative, hand-centric capitalism? Big question. Anybody want to try to take that on? Or any part of that question? Or even just the first section about making sense of rumors, conspiracies, in the perceptions of zero COVID.
Well,
because we have seen...
maybe I'll take on the media question a little bit since theoretically my job in Taiwan. So, but couple different strands, right? So one is so one of a survey that was done in 2020, the spring of 2020, was because of SARS, et cetera, a lot of Chinese abroad, like your first response is to wear a mask, right? And then of course, not only were we told that mask wearing was not important, but there was a large scale survey of overseas students in the US, and the first response was they were more scared of anti-Chinese violence than they were of COVID, right? So if you wore a mask, you basically put a target on your back. And so one of the things that I've really seen in the last several years is these multiple strands, some conspiracy, some having factual basis, but all of them really imbricated and very, very hard to disentangle for so many people. And, you know, so on one hand, you can poo-poo and say everything on WeChat is this kind of conspiracy mongering, you know, like that you heard and people are passing around. But on the other hand, somebody will come back and say, well, no, actually my neighbor, I was just in Southern California last week, and every single conversation I had with Chinese elders was about their fear of being robbed and beaten up and, you know, shot at, which is not conspiracy either, right? Because this is also happening. And I guess that's why I was just trying to illustrate something about the way in which all these news threads are kind of tangled together and hard to parse. And so when you want to say zero COVID good, zero COVID bad, there's no such thing, because there's always going to be another tangle or another way of looking at it. And I also like, I saw somebody in the QA and he mentioned that overseas Chinese students reacted very strongly to all the zero COVID and the news they were getting from home, but that if you talk to elders, and this is true also my family elders, they did not feel as strongly about the news, right? So maybe this is back to, so is that a question of generation and news, or is that a question of location and news? So I feel like we need to think in terms of, but I think maybe the answer is both, you know, but the way that people repartition spatially, but also repartition generationally, and also of course social class. And I should mention, even though there is all this, and me among them, talking about the transnational solidarity, this has also been a great period of xenophobia, right? This has been justified xenophobia. So I speak from the Taiwan point of view, and I think this was also true in Hong Kong, but you know, that because border closing and zero COVID led to a lot of success in places that locked down, there was incredible justification to look at people who are unlike you or not from your community as very dangerous people. And so, and that actually really, really encouraged like anti-migrant xenophobia in Taiwan, for example. And so something that Taiwan in its success story would never want to talk about. So I feel like there's also those kinds of strands that, and then maybe the final kind of interesting strand is at these protests, one of the things that a lot of Chinese students were saying, feeling very angered about COVID, was they found themselves being, they tended to be students who were leftist or liberal and participate in a lot of global and US movements like Black Lives Matter, et cetera. But they realized that none of their leftist white friends want to stand with them because they felt like, for a lot of people, they felt like the protesting China zero COVID was being conservative, right? Was being right wing, was being a dupe for, the CIA, et cetera. And so a lot of them felt very abandoned by their left communities that they were very involved with internationally and in the US. So it's kind of interesting to think also about those kinds of dispersals of also news sources. So yeah, I'm not sure that addresses the question, but.
Can I jump in on one of the questions that came through in the chat was about the analogy of the Great Leap Forward and problematics with that. And I thought one thing that didn't come up was I was struck more, and Wang Feng, my colleague in demography here, was the one-child policy, where you had this kind of way in which some people could feel there was a scientific basis for it. And then it just went on to a point where all potential early justification for it was gone, and yet it sort of lingered, and that there was an arc. It was a much shorter arc with zero COVID to the rapid opening, but there was a similar sense of what seemed the mixing of a kind of scientific rationale, whether it was correct or not, and then the leadership becoming so wedded to it that it wasn't listening to any counter arguments. And then, it was, again, a much faster time frame, but that might be one of the ways to think about it, rather than, because the Great Leap Forward goes to like, it's been gone for so long, but here we are back again. Well, actually, there have been campaigns periodically that went on too long, even later than that.
So can we think of it as a kind of that kind of syncopation or kind of the fracturing of historical time? Like I felt like that's something that really struck me, even in my own experience of this era, is that everybody was living on a different timeline. So Nathan was saying also about people who work on China, but then students who have family in China also experienced it differently. Elders who were wary of getting the vaccine in China experienced it differently. I had relatives like that, right, who refused to get the vaccine, but then they basically became shut-ins, right? So those of us who are abroad were saying, what? We all trust a vaccine. Do you know how many people around the world have gotten vaccines? But then they felt, very legitimate reasons, or also not trusting the domestic vaccine. But, so I felt like people were experiencing news and history in totally fragmented ways, in a way that we hadn't seen in a long time, given, global news.
And if I could just add a sentence there, is that, this question of, whether the zero COVID years are in any way analogous to, even let's just say something like Great Leap Forward, I think is just a very rich question, and we're not going to resolve it tonight. And I think we could easily go for hours on the different angles. And the one part of it that I want to kind of underscore as at least one argument for why the analogy works is just the sort of universal nature of the experience within China, and being so different from other places at a certain point. So, of course, there have been campaigns, all sorts of campaigns. I mean, that's the primary modality of the Chinese Communist Party. But for this campaign to be felt so universally within China and so uniquely within China, I think does set it apart from other things, and maybe gets us closer to that analogy with the Great Leap Forward being a good one.
If I may,
a quick pushback. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, no, I just wanted to say, but how about Jeff's point about Alec not experiencing in Yunnan? But anyway, so Gina, please go ahead.
Sure. And again, like I said, we could go hours along these lines and trying to figure out where the lines are the most meaningful and where the differences are more meaningful. I think could occupy us for a good amount of time.
maybe a way to combine those 2 points is that everybody had a different COVID experience, but everyone is united in that we all had a COVID experience. Like there was, I think it was even Alec, who I don't know and didn't read what he wrote, but I think even just having taken your first COVID test several years in doesn't mean that it didn't affect. I mean, everybody had some sort of experience, I would think. Well, I was in response to this question, which I think is really interesting. Is thinking about conspiracies and tropes and perceptions. And I think what this person is asking is about how sort of the West is like ideas of what the West is have implicated Chinese responses to zero COVID. I also want to once again echo Nathan's point that one of the things that has happened because of COVID is that most of us who study China haven't been there in a very long time, and that there's a point at which we are studying blind in a way that we haven't done in decades. But that said, I think that there's a way in which I think the West there are Wests multiple, right, within China that are deployed and imagined for very, I think, contextual and local purposes. So I think for somebody who is frustrated at zero COVID, an imagined West of a place where you can protest seems really, and it doesn't have to be the entirety of the West. It doesn't have to be the West that is also like violently putting down protest. It can just be a particular kind of imagining that fits that moment. For people who want to criticize the West, spreading theories about the problems with Western vaccines, which was a very widespread rumor for a very long time that Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were significantly worse than Sinovac, that serves a particular purpose, and that this can get even sort of layered on top of each other. So I think that a lot of online protesters in China became aware that when the Chinese government was anticipating frustrations or anger or pushback, they would put out some sort of anti-Western propaganda, and that became a way for them, for young people or anybody, right, to further criticize the government for sort of using these tropes, right? And another sort of layer on that is one of the things I noticed in Hong Kong is that a way to push back against the 2019 protesters is, rather than sort of understand this image of liberal democracy, Western liberal democracy that some protesters latched onto, they would sort of say, well, they're just worshiping the West in total, right? Like all of it. And then they would point out all of the problems that we have in the United States and stuff. And so we have lots of different overlapping and overlaying like Wests that exist. And I think understanding what somebody means when they say West, what somebody means when they say liberal and democratic ideals within that context doesn't tell us anything really about the West. It tells us of how people are deploying an imaginary to serve particular political purposes. And there are so many different ones within China that I think that's what that reveals.
Thank you, Gina. Unfortunately, I think our time is almost up. We could easily go another 90 minutes and I think have an equally rich and dynamic conversation. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the Q&A questions in the box. I know our panelists did read your questions, and I'm sure it will inspire future meditations and thought about these issues. I know one of the takeaways for me is just how quickly all of this has been unfolding and transforming. 3 months ago, when not all of us, but a group of us met, we had a very different conversation. Had we met a month ago, I think it would have been a much darker conversation. I have a lot of friends who are filmmakers in China, and 2 months ago, they were ready to throw in the towel and go to Europe or go to America and start making films. And now a lot of them are saying, things are starting to open up a bit. And so the dynamic change that we've witnessed over these last 3 months has really been somewhat unprecedented. And I think we're all eager to see what the next page will bring. But I want to end by thanking our 6 wonderful, talented, brilliant scholars and contributors. And thank you to our audience members, everyone who supports the Center for Chinese Studies at UCLA. Please follow us on our website to get information about upcoming events. We have a very active calendar, and I encourage you to visit the websites of all of our participants and read their publications, listen to their blogs and I know Tingguo has a great Chinese language blog that she hosts, but we look forward to seeing you in other forms in the future. And thank you again, everyone. Take care and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Michael.
Michael.
Are we still recording?
I think it's live streaming, so
Okay.
Yeah.
I had a question for you, but I'll ask you some other time.
we'll